Hello everyone, I'm Andy Haldane, Chief Executive of the RSA, and delighted to be here speaking in the closing session of this Northern Powerhouse Summit on Education, Employment and Skills. I know you've had a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'm sure we've heard some fantastic discussion and speeches from them on these absolutely crucial questions. The macroeconomic backdrop to this summit could not be more challenging. We all know, and I'm sure you've heard a lot already, about the difficulties being caused by the cost of living crisis. That's affecting families, the length and breadth, of course, of the UK, but none more than families and places that have been struggling, in some cases for many years, in others for many decades. It's also the case, though, that accompanying this challenge are some huge opportunities to level up the country, to unlock opportunity among those people and within those places that have been struggling for years and in some cases decades. And indeed, as part of the Levelling Up white paper, which I contributed towards, we put some numbers to the extent of the potential that might be unlocked for those people in those places. And that runs to tens, if not hundreds, of billions of pounds each year. So the size of the prize here, the scale of the opportunity, could not be greater, particularly in the light of that cost of living crisis. Now, the theme of the summit has been about bridging the gap, and it's clear to everyone, I think, that those gaps spatially across the UK are absolutely enormous and indeed have been getting wider over time, certainly over the last 50 to 70 years. Those gaps are big between regions, between north and south. But indeed, those differences spatially are also very large and widening within regions. The problems we're often dealing with are genuinely hyper-local, and that underscores the extent and scale of the levelling up challenge that we all face. And that levelling up challenge isn't confined to gaps just in pay and in living standards. It shows up in levels of longevity. It shows up in levels of well-being. It shows up in levels of attainment in schools and in levels of skills in society. So the gaps are many and various. They cover pretty much every aspect of the life cycle. And therefore, if we are to tackle those gaps, close those gaps over time, what the Levelling Up white paper made clear is that we will need a multi-pronged strategy, one that speaks not just to what's sometimes called human capital, but to physical capital, to cultural capital, to institutional capital, to social capital. And the plan that was put in place in the white paper hopefully spoke to each and every one of those capitals. The particular theme I want to touch on in the remaining part of my remarks, however, was around the crucial issue of skills, the crucial question of human capital, because looking across the UK, plainly, those gaps in skills, those gaps in educational attainment are very significant and in some ways have become even more significant over time. By skills and by education, I don't, of course, just refer to cognitive skills, to academic skills, but even more importantly, to non-cognitive skills and to vocational attainment of various types. In some ways, the skill shortages, the skills deficits are even more acute when it comes to those non-cognitive skills and those vocational skills in ways that should worry us along at least two distinct, if related, dimensions. And the first relates to aggregate growth in the economy and a strategy for that. And the second relates to the distribution of that growth across the economy. In other words, levelling up. And I think we need to tackle with real zeal the skills problem if we are to have any hope of both boosting growth at the aggregate level and to shift and to shrink those widening distributional disparities in different parts of the country. And to make this point concrete, let me start just by making some observations on the drivers of growth in the UK over the past, say, 15 years since the dawning of the global financial crisis. So economists like me sometimes decompose growth in the economy into two components. It can come either from a growth in the number of people working or from a rise in the productivity of those workers in the economy. It can come from one or other of those cylinders. If you decompose UK growth over the last 15 years, you will find that almost all of the growth has come from the first cylinder, the words expansion in the number of workers, rather than improvements in the productivity of those workers. Productivity over that period is largely flat-lined, and almost all of the growth has come from an increased number of workers. Some of those have come from increased participation in the workforce, particularly by older people, and particularly by women. Those are very encouraging trends. And some has also come from an increased number of people arriving from other countries through net immigration. Now, that backward-looking diagnosis of growth is very relevant when it comes to looking forward and thinking about growth in future. What we found over the last couple of years is that those trends have gone into reverse. That rather than expanding, the workforce has been contracting over the last couple of years, and that's partly because that net flow of workers from overseas has reduced. But more materially, it's been because participation in the labour force has been declining, bucking its pre-COVID trends. Almost as many as 1 million people have left the UK labour force over the last couple of years, perhaps partly for lifestyle reasons and partly for reasons of COVID-related long-term sickness. And that's super relevant, of course, because that means that first cylinder of UK growth has now stalled. It has now seized up. And on the assumption that cylinder doesn't start firing up again in future, what we'll need is a second cylinder, in other words, growth in productivity, to pick up if we are to drive forward aggregate growth in the economy. And on that second cylinder, what is the secret source of improvements in productivity? Well, of course, that is reliant on skills, on improving the skill set of our workforce. And as those 1 million people have exited the UK workforce, we've seen skill shortages become more acute than at any time in my working lifetime. That's why the stock of vacancies, unfilled vacancies in the economy, is at its highest ever level. And those skill shortages, those staff shortages, are very broadly based. They are true across pretty much every sector, and they are true across pretty much every region of the UK. Solving and sorting out those skills deficits of long standing, but made more acute by events of the past 2 years, is going to be crucial for driving aggregate growth in the economy, and particularly crucial in those parts of the country that have done less well historically and which suffer from the largest and longest lived skills deficits of various types. So given that prognosis, rather gloomy prognosis, on both aggregate performance and distributional performance of the economy, what is to be done? Well, I mean, the good news is quite a lot already is being done. There are new initiatives aplenty that speak to those skills deficits problems. Think about T-levels, which we should also all aspire in time to have equal status to A-levels. Think about the local skills improvement plans, the LSIPs that are being put in place, very place specific, very focused on the skills needed in the workplace. Think about the lifetime learning guarantee, a means of enabling skill building throughout the life cycle in older adults as well as in younger adults. I'd say there's initiatives, generally speaking, directionally right. They are, if you like, a down payment on what you might call a 21st century model of education. The model that has served us so well in the 19th and 20th century focused on building cognitive skills in young people. That model worked well in centuries past. It will not work well in the 21st century. For the 21st century, the educational model needs to focus on older as well as younger as an educational model, and it needs to focus on non-cognitive as well as cognitive skills. So these are useful down payments, but I would suggest more is needed in both scale and scope if that new 21st century model of skill building is to become a reality, given the scale and scope of the skills deficits I've mentioned. Let me mention one final point, which is, for all the fact that qualifications are great and educational institutions are crucially important, let's not forget the absolutely fundamental role that the private sector plays, that companies play when it comes to skill building and closing those skills deficits. Much of the skill building, much of the training that people have takes place on the job. And truth be told, UK companies are towards the bottom of the international league table when it comes to the amount they spend in training their staff, in investing in their staff. So if we are to close those skill deficits right across the country, but particularly in those places doing less well, I think companies will need to invest as never before in the skills of their staff. That war for talent makes that now an absolute imperative. It's no longer the case that companies can go and pinch skills from other companies, because we know we have an aggregate deficit of skills. We suffer from a fallacy of composition if companies think they can outsource their skill building to other companies. Now is the time. A stronger case could be made now than at any point in the last 50 years for companies themselves investing in their staff as never before. And the debate ought to be about, what would it take to deliver that? Are there tax incentives needed for companies to do more to invest in their staff? Are there other schemes that could be in place to encourage companies to invest more in their people? Ultimately, that has to be part of the solution to this chronic skills deficit of long-standing, but made more acute of the past few years. Those are issues for the future. They pose a real challenge today, to both growth and to levelling out. But they also pose a great opportunity to both level up and to grow the economy. Way back, someone said that the policy agenda of their government needs to be three things, which was education, education, and education. And for today, several years on, several decades on, the mantra needs to change. The mantra needs instead to be skills, skills, skills. And this summit, I think, has been a fantastic down payment itself on making good on that mantra. Thank you, everyone, for listening.